Hello and welcome. In this video we're going to be looking at the poetry of John Donne, and in his poetry what we're going to be looking at is we're going to look at some of the main themes and ideas. We're just going to go through them one by one, the ones that are on the HSC syllabus at least, we're going to go through one by one, and just go through some of the main ideas and themes which you will then go off and explore and investigate, not only in relation to certain ideas to do with him and his metaphysical poetry, and we'll go into that in term in a minute, but also to have a look at the ideas that are evoked through his use of language, through his use of style, and also basically to give you a sort of a running start in terms of what ideas you can then further explore, what sorts of themes you can use as a main discussion piece, and the sorts of ideas which you then can go on to greater depth. So let's just go into the man himself first and really look at him. So John Donne was a man who lived from roughly, historical data isn't clear, but about 1573 to 1631. And he was a British Renaissance poet. So the British Renaissance did happen a little bit after the initial Renaissance in Italy. And this was the time where it was really moving into gear. And his poetry was famous for themes such as life, death, and also religion as well. Now, when we're talking about John Donne, he was a very spiritual man, and his work is dubbed metaphysical as such. Now, metaphysical can refer to a number of things, and it's usually something that deals with a great deal of emotion. However, because of John Donne's work, and perhaps because of it, we refer to metaphysical as being relation to not only heavily romantic themes, but also those that happen to do with God as well. And indeed, John Donne's relationship with God was quite complex, and indeed with the church. For John Donne was born a Catholic minister, or to a Catholic family, in a time where Catholic worship was outlawed in England, under basically what happened under Henry VIII. So here we had a man whose, own interpretation of faith was, indeed, his true religion was hidden for a time. But also later on, you see a man who's exploring his faith in quite deep and complex ways. And certainly, if you're not familiar with Christianity and the many values at the heart of Christianity, nor basically the idea of how it was worshipped at the time, then initially John Donne's poems are very difficult to first grasp. But if you do a little bit of research on them, then you'll find that they become much easier. And certainly, if you look more at his ideas rather than necessarily the religious concepts and work on understanding those religious concepts, then it makes it much easier to sort of look at his work far more objectively. Okay, so let's go through his poems, and perhaps his most famous one we'll look at to start with, which is Death Be Not Proud. Now, Death Be Not Proud is essentially about it's Donne's argument about why death should not be feared. Now, in his particular way of thinking, death is not something which is a great obstacle as such, or something that really has a great deal of power over people, but something that is indeed a transition. And this transition from life into death is one that is not necessarily worthy of the great fear that I guess many people, and even now, still fear. So what he essentially does in this poem is he tries to belittle it, and he personifies death. So by personifying and belittling death, he starts to set up this paradox of death being something itself which can die. Now, through developing this paradox, he uses a number of metaphors and he uses a number of images which sort of suggest that death is not quite as powerful as it may seem to be. For instance, he uses the idea of poppies, for instance, as something which can make people fall asleep. Now, this, of course, relates to poppies being used in opium, which can make people sleep in a way that is quite similar to death. And indeed, death itself is something that is mirrored by sleep, that if you looked at a sleeping person and a person who was dead, they would almost look the same. And saying that the power of death is really just as equal as the power of sleep. Maybe this is one of his arguments that's not quite based in a rational train of thought, but the thing is, by looking at those two and putting them side by side, he helps to try, or seeks to at least try and limit the power of death. And he also calls death a slave, particularly as it's something that is the slave of kings, of desperate men, all those things. And that it's one of those things where death is constantly called to serve others rather than others ultimately being served by the nature of life, which is death. Or at least that death is something that eventually is something that comes up in their lives. Now, this is also tied in with his Christian belief. He is a man of devout Christian faith, don't forget. And his death is met with eternal life. And so it's not really a death at all. It's simply a transition point. And so when we look at his end, we see not only his end, but a new beginning come as well. So at the moment he dies, his life is reborn. Now this reflects the crude personification, and that it is proud, and this comes in with the title. So the title of Death Be Not Proud almost suggests that death is this smug individual who feels proud of being able to harvest lives, being able to hold people with fear. Almost you imagine the Reaper and sort of this image coming to mind. And indeed this is what he tries to belittle, and this is what he tries to sort of, I guess, numb with this poem. So certainly it's one of those poems which really sort of takes an antagonistic jibe, but does so in a way which is almost with a sense of humour, and yet reflects as well the man's spirituality. Now the next poem we're going to look at is we're going to be looking at This Is My Play's Last Scene. Now despite the title and I guess the sense of connotation, this is not really a poem as much about death as it may initially seem. And it's more something that's based on a style of meditation in the period, which basically looks at thinking of peace. And of course, death is associated with peace in this sense. So the idea of This Is My Play's Last Scene is not so much saying that this is me about to fall off the perch. Indeed, this poem was probably written many, many years before he actually died. But it's more something based on being at peace and that sort of voidlessness, emptiness that death brings, and trying to emulate that in a sort of a meditation. Indeed, it's not one of the more, certainly looking at it from a modern context, you wouldn't necessarily consider death to be a form of meditation. However, in this case, the imagining of death is something that he used to relax himself. And in this poem, Donne's persona imagines his deathbed, and he chronicles his ascension from earth to heaven. This is essentially a spiritual exercise. It's one where he puts his soul through a number of tests, and particularly he prays for his ascension from earth to heaven. And certainly he also imagines a number of other things that go on. There's a number of analogies he uses, first of all, such as that title, The Last Run Race. So this is essentially him chronicling his 11th hour, his final moments of his life, of his existence. And doing so, where he basically almost predicts, or tries to state in advance what will happen. And there is this conflict between his soul, which happens as well, where we see his good things, his good qualities, his spiritual mortal flesh and his sins going to different places. His spirit ascends to heaven. His mortal flesh, it stays in the ground where he's buried. And his sins, the things which he believes are holding him down, will fall off him, sort of like raindrops. They'll sort of drip off him and then fall down to hell. So there's this imagery of this man who is ascending and his body going to different places. So that's essentially, it's one that is heavily tied into this religious philosophy that Donne often keeps in a lot of his poetry. And this is probably, I think, it was written shortly before he did become into the Christian ministry. So certainly this is one that sort of ties into that. Okay, moving on. We'll go on to the next poem. At the Round Earth's Imagined Corners Below. Now, this is a poem which initially sort of, you might think, would tie down to the idea of the earth being flat and having corners. However, this is not necessarily, or this is not really the case with this poem. The poem is about the second coming of Jesus, essentially, and it's about basically the dead rising and be judged. And again, this is about him and his persona fantasizing about how his soul is going to be judged when he passes from one world into the next. Now, with the second coming of Jesus, this is when it believes his judgment will come. And now this judgment doesn't affect him, it affects everyone. So he basically lists these manners of death, all these the ways that people have died, and says that with the second coming of Christ, their bodies will be reanimated in order for them to be judged. Now, he sort of has this twisted sense of imagination. He sort of imagines them not as skeletons or something along those lines, but simply as their bodies are. So perhaps their souls being reanimated, or something to do with their bodies as they were when they died, being reanimated to be rejudged. Or to be judged, should I say. So all these manners of death, all these accidents, these natural disasters, all these phenomena which have come about, are ways in which the dead have been taken, and through, I guess, Christ's coming, we get their judgment and whether they go to heaven. All right. And Donne's persona speaks of his own judgment as well, and he speaks of it quite paradoxically, in that he asks for repentance through the blood of Jesus. Now, for those of you who study the Bible a bit, knows that with Jesus' crucifixion and his blood being let out, he was basically allowing humankind to be forgiven. So really what he's asking is to be earning his forgiveness. So not basically just accepting that because Jesus died on the cross that I get forgiven. He's asking again that he earns this blood seal, this blood right, that he is able to also accept not only his good judgment, or the fact that he has done well, that he is able to ascend to heaven, that he has been, pure in his soul, but also that he is able to earn it. So there is this paradox there, and it sets up this idea, this challenge through this poem, that he does not believe himself worthy, and yet somehow he believes himself entitled at the same time. So there's this paradox that sort of sets up an ambiguous and sort of thought-provoking ending. But that's basically, it's a very short poem, and indeed it doesn't really hit any emotional heights, but it does certainly reflect a man whose faith is one that he likes to continue to test. And certainly the emotion comes at the end, where he sort of really starts to hammer home this point, am I worthy, am I worthy? And it uses this ending to sort of reinforce that. Okay, moving on. In Poisonous Minerals. Now, Poisonous Minerals is basically, it's a soliloquy or a prayer. And it's one that's done in two parts. And it's initially one that might seem a bit melancholy, in that he laments, and basically that God forgives animals and even things like poisons, that they cause ills, they cause crimes, that a dog can do all these things and yet be immune from sin, and yet a person who does less, criminal things than dogs do, not imagining many dog criminals, but this is Donne's thinking, and that he's almost frustrated with this process of having to constantly atone for the things that he has done. And yet he then shifts his tone. He shifts one who is now begging mercy, and he asks all these questions for God about, why do I have to do all these things? Why do I have to be so pure, so righteous? Why do I have to constantly atone for the things I do? And he realizes there's no point. He doesn't question God's will anymore, and he does continue to pray for forgiveness. So it's one where, I guess, looking at the outside, this is Donne's persona, I guess, almost testing his faith and challenging his faith to a point where you may say, well, is he questioning his beliefs? I don't think at any point he's questioning his beliefs. What he's doing is, I guess, testing his own particular faith and testing how does he feel and why does he feel this frustration. He feels this frustration because he knows he believes in God so much, and he indeed wishes that his faith be stronger. So he asks these questions, only then to basically ask and plead for forgiveness still, because of the fact that he still wants to believe, and he still wants to have his faith, and he still wants his faith to be strong. So that's why at the end, this poem changes tact. So it starts off being one that almost, I wouldn't say attacks God, but one that questions these religious values, to one that asks for forgiveness based on those things he's just questioned. So that's basically if poisonous minerals. Moving on, we'll go on to Hymn to my God, in my sickness. Now this is literally his last poem. And it was reputedly written about 8 days before he actually did pass away. So it was on his deathbed. He was dying. He was quite ill at this point. And certainly it's one of those ones where he actually, strangely enough, seems quite different from a lot of his other poetry. And the first reason is not only does he make a number of religious analogies, indeed he did that with a lot of his poems before that, and particularly in this poem he does it with this device of a map. And he makes a number of cartographical, or basically map-based analogies. He first of all compares his body to a map that physicians and doctors are cutting up to try and get to the heart of a disease, but also the map is being something of a spiritual one. Not only does he hope to be able to find his way to heaven, which is again where the map metaphor comes in, but also that it sort of outlays the religious landscape in which he is praying to. So the idea, for instance, in Christian belief at that particular time, that the Garden of Eden and the place where Christ was crucified are one and the same place. And he makes a reference to that. He makes a number of references to the sun and to east and west, basically west, the direction where heaven is. So he makes a number of different analogies. He also is basically not asking for healing. This is a man who is at peace. He's a man who is basically waiting to die. He asks not to be healed. He doesn't ask for any more medicine or anything else like that. He simply wishes to go. So, and he basically is praying now for a peaceful death. So, as I mentioned before, he does make a number of these references, and he's almost recounting his faith. So he's outlining a number of death-related images. And certainly this is one of those things where death is as much an aspect of love in his life. And his love is because of the fact that beyond, in the afterlife, that God is waiting for him. So really this is a man who is, I guess, in love with the idea that finally after this time I'm going to go to heaven. I'm going to meet my maker, and this is something of a great almost fascination for me now, is that I've given up on living, and this is the next step in my life, is death. So there's these references to the Bible in that sense, that he wants to basically almost brush up on his, I wouldn't say brush up on his ideas of religion, but basically that he references religion in such a way that he knows that when he goes to the next stage of his life, that he will indeed face his maker, and certainly his soul will go to heaven, and he almost 100% believes that at this point. Okay, so let's look at a valediction forbidding mourning. Now, this poem of Donne's was about his going away on a voyage, and was basically almost like a love letter addressed to his wife. Now, it is a poem which has a lot of qualities which talk about two spirits joined together, and so it's not so much a farewell sort of poem as it is, don't miss me, don't feel sorry for me, don't feel sorry for yourself because I'm gone. So to really show his attachment to his lover, I guess, his wife. It makes a number of conceits and analogies about how their love is special, and that's how he proves his love special for his lover. And he does it basically by using a number of, as I said, different analogies. And what these analogies are things which start as basically two pieces, but sort of stick together as a whole, or can be spread out. So if you're looking at, for instance, the metaphor of gold, It's something that you can beat with a hammer. So it starts as this big clump, and then once you beat it with a hammer and do all the usual processes to sort of thin it down a little bit, you can make it stretch really, really a really long way. So something that's a small clump and then stretched out really long is like how they're going to conquer their division from each other, is by spreading out and spreading like gold leaf is. Connection to death, and that idea that, okay, death is a prominent theme in Donne's poetry, but it's also something to indicate how spirits are connected. The same as to spheres, the point where the earth is the center of the world, and everything else it goes around a bit. So for that reason as well, it represents the fact that they are the most important thing, the most special thing, and they're always going to be connected because everything that goes around is because of them. The most prominent conceit he makes, though, is the one with the compass. And the compass metaphor is basically one that's expanded, which is to indicate that they are two parts operating as one. And that's to play on the idea that a compass is really two different pieces that move together. And so she is at the center, and he is following her. And it sort of also draws in this full circle message, where as far as the compass will go, they will still end up together, and they will go back and be with each other again. So that's basically it. It's a poem which represents, through a number of turns of phrases and language, and through a number of different conceits, how their love is special and how they'll continue to be connected to each other. The next poem we're going to look at is the Apparition. Now, this is one of his earlier poems, and it's a revenge fantasy. It's very much a story, and it's a very interesting sort of story. It is a man basically scorning his lover, whom in return he promises to haunt, and her new love. So essentially, he's been dumped by a lady, and a pretty lady at that. And in spite of being dumped, he promises to haunt her. He promises to become a spirit, and one who will continue to hunt her down until she forgives him and takes him back. But then it also tries to position her in a number of ways. For instance, it tries to position her as being impure. She's not a virgin. She is quite promiscuous. She sleeps around. All these things. He's quite insulting to her. He's quite almost angry. And indeed, this poem presents a sort of very deep anger and a threatening nature as well. He threatens her with this ghostly promise that he won't reveal until the night she is in bed with her new lover. So but essentially, he's saying that I've got this secret, but to terrify you even more, I'm not going to tell you what it is. So he's getting creepy now. He's really trying to not only terrify, I guess, his ex-lover, but to make her regret breaking up with him. And this is a poem really about love in almost a vindictive sort of sense. And that he's trying to force her to stay with him. That indicates that others are worse than he is, and that in fact she should ask for forgiveness from him. So this is a poem essentially about this very complex range of emotions that he is feeling, or this persona is feeling, after being basically told by a lover of his to go away. That he's essentially saying that you'll never be this happy with me again, that you must stay with me, you must be with me, that basically you need to ask me for forgiveness because I'm going to haunt you otherwise. I'm going to haunt you, and every time you find a new lover, you may try and seek comfort in his arms, but you won't find it because you're basically an impure woman. You're not one who's going to ever love a man again. This is this is one of those poems that really allows a lot of people, and certainly a lot of critics have done, sort of peer into this sort of viewpoint of him and call him, among other things, misogynistic and certainly one who has a complex relationship with women in his life, and particularly probably up to the point where he's married. He's quite a ladies' man. He's one who, I wouldn't necessarily call him a user of women, but he's one person whose love life is indeed quite a complex journey. All right, The Relic on the other hand, is a complete contrast, and again, it's one of his later works, where his persona is fantasizing, again, of all things, about his exhumation. And it's one of those ones which is tied in, again, to this Christian philosophy, and particularly this trend that was going around in Britain at the time of religious relics. And essentially what it was that a lot of these relics were going on displays in cathedrals. And in this poem, he's sort of imagining himself as what happens when someone digs him up and makes him a relic. So he's fantasizing about that. Now, he hasn't been buried alone in this case. He's been buried with himself and his lover. And immediately he puts this image down of his woman being more than one to a bed, so insisting or perhaps suggesting that she's carrying a child as well. And indeed, he puts them and the relationship in not only extremely high esteem, but he also likens it to this love he's feeling as well. That his love he's feeling for whoever the subject of this poem is, this lover he's buried next to, is quite strong, is really profound, and that if someone were to dig him up, it would be something worth worshipping because of the fact that they are so much in love. That he fantasizes them being relics like the bones of Mary Magdalene, which were on display. Now, compared to the Apparition, as I said before, this poem has a lot more of a sense of purity about it. These loves are pure. They are, in this case, the lover is considered to be a lot truer, as in she is a virgin and that their love is true. She's not a promiscuous woman. She's not any of these other things. They are madly in love. They are spiritually and soulfully connected in so many ways. And so being able to, I guess, dig up their bones is a sign that they are bonded together and that they have a love that's really worth celebrating and worshipping in such a way that sort of scholars at the time were digging up bones and digging up these different relics to celebrate them and their religious and spiritual importance. And indeed, they are also those kinds of lovers who are indeed quite innocent. They are ones who kiss on their first date, or kiss on greeting and farewell, should I say, but not between meals. So when they are very innocent in terms of lovers. In fact, I shouldn't say they kiss on first date because they probably don't, but that they are essentially very spiritually pure, that their relationship is not ruled by things like sex, that it's essentially a very true sort of relationship. All right. Now, the final poem we're going to be looking at is the Sunne Rising. Now, the Sunne Rising is basically, again, it's about Donne's love life. Surprise, surprise. And their lover being woken up after a long night together by the sun in the morning. Now, in this case, Donne takes a very mischievous tone. He sort of is a little bit cheeky about this. And now he feels aggrieved that the sun has come and ruined this great romantic evening, in which case they're supposed to, when the sun comes up, they're supposed to wake up, go to breakfast, and that's it. They don't see each other again or something like that. But he believes that this sun has come up and ruined the romantic evening that the lover and he had shared, and that they now must part. And he's quite insistent on this. And that he wishes to simply go back to bed and be with his lover some more. Now, he takes a tone mocking it, and that basically the lover and he share something more important. But also he believes that the sun should be going off and waking up those who need to be woken up, the school kids, the ones who need to go to school, the king's gamemen, where basically they'll wake up and say it's a good day for the king to go out and hunt. All these different things, that there should be other people, like it's a rude alarm clock that should be bothering someone else. And that, again, he and his lover are so connected that the sun can't interrupt them. And he makes a number of puns again, that he could block out the sun by simply closing his eyes. And yes, that's also true, but also that he suggests that by doing this, he would be stopping himself from looking at his lover, who is so beautiful, that she is more beautiful than sunlight. And indeed takes a much grander scale by almost likening himself to a god. And this is where this misogynistic angle of, I guess, Donne's poetry does again rear its head, where by not being able to look at her, and by basically positioning himself as, and them both indeed, as centers of the universe, where he is the, I guess, the creator, and that she is also there as well as part of this, that they are essentially their own world. And this is where the idea of the spheres come back up again, in that in this belief at the time the earth was the center of the universe. And certainly he believes that his bedroom is the center of the universe, and that their love is so true and even outrageous, I guess, that nothing else in the world matters. It's only him and his love. So that's basically the Sunne Rising. And essentially it's one of those ones where, again, he uses this divine, and indeed the sun is something that is spiritually connected to him. It's also one of those poems like Death Be Not Proud, where he sort of challenges the divineness a bit. And the sun is a divine object, and particularly Christian culture, of the time, is it something that is considered to be divine and true, and by mocking it, he considers his love worthy of such divinity. So that's basically it for the poems of John Donne. Certainly hope that the analysis here has been helpful to you. Certainly these are the poems on the HSC list, and certainly there are others out there. But when you look at these sorts of themes, there are themes which are recurring, and particularly ones which continue on throughout his poetry. So if you are stuck, simply look at other similar poems of that nature. And really, because of his body of work being fairly consistent up in certain stages, certainly his earlier work is ones which sort of reflect a more flamboyant and womanizing individual, and his later ones are probably a lot more spiritual. But even then, there are a number of trends which are current in all of his work, and there's certainly themes that you can apply quite readily. But otherwise, that's about it for Donne's poetry. Until next time, see you later.